Today on our Tech for Business podcast, Kyle, our CEO and president, and Scott, our director of strategic services, are here to cut through the noise and give you their top strategic initiatives that are going to make that big impact this year. When I say that, is there something that comes to mind? Is there one thing or two things that really come to mind for you?
Yeah, there are. And naturally, they all revolve around cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
The last 3 to 5 years has been daunting for a lot of organizations who have an onslaught of these new recommendations or warnings or regulatory concerns that, they need to find a way to budget for and somehow absorb. And, at the end of the day, just like CIT, organizations just want their people to be able to perform their job function,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then not have technology get in the way. And I think there's been a bit of a sentiment like that. People are experiencing what I would define as fatigue around this stuff, right? And it's coming from all kinds of different places. It's coming from, we see advertisements for Threat Locker and cybersecurity tools and, big sports games and places like this. Is coming from everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you trust? And how do you navigate that? And, certainly we're here to my role is to try to be relatively agnostic with, those recommendations and come at it from a perspective of best practice, right? So when I think about what that means and what best practice looks like today, it's dramatically different than it was, again, kind of 3 to 5, 10 years ago, right? When you need firewall and you need antivirus. Those were kind of the two big things we really needed to make sure everybody had. And today it's dramatically different. Your run-of-the-mill average, firewall is simply not enough. Your run-of-the-mill legacy, what I would call antivirus, is not enough. We're driving those conversations. You need AI-driven endpoint detection and response, right? You need something that is not just responding to an event. You need something that can be predictive about behavior. You need tools that can be predictive about behavior in your environment and stop threats or events before they occur, right? So that's an interesting way that vendors are using AI. There's a whole nother conversation about businesses can use AI. So we need intelligent, protective tools that are taking action prior to an event actually happening, right? So that's one thing, right? So managed detection and response, endpoint detection and response, those kinds of things are what we're talking about. And another one is multi-factor authentication. Years ago, everybody's bank, you got a text message and this is what we're going to do now. Every time you log into your bank, we're going to send you a text and make sure it's you. I was just on the phone today with my Merrill Lynch advisor, and in order to move forward with that kind of a phone call, they need to send you a text and verify who you are. So it's very commonplace in lots of different aspects of how we manage our lives, and our business technology really should be no different. So multi-factor authentication is another one of those big red flags. If you don't have this, I'm telling you, you need to hear the urgency in my voice. I'm telling you that this is me saying your brakes are at 90%, your tires are at 90%. I can't let you drive away in that car, right? For your own safety. That kind of a message, big red flags, right? And we need to implement that everywhere possible. All of the external entry points, all of the Office 365 email user accounts, they all need to have that second factor included. Those are very kind of low hanging ones, right? One that is starting to kind of rise to the surface, I'm having more and more conversations around, is legacy VPN replacement.
Yeah.
Right. So I think everybody who's been dealing with remote access still has on-premise, servers and technology that remote users need to get to, is potentially still dealing with that kind of legacy process where users have a little piece of software on their computer and they got to kind of initiate that thing and they've got to log in. Maybe and that is one of those places that should include multi-factor authentication. But that technology is becoming legacy. The bad actors in the world are starting to identify and find vulnerabilities in that technology. And so we're having conversations with customers to give them some notice that this is, we're starting to hear more of this We're hearing about breaches in these scenarios. We've even had a customer or two experience some of this. And so the conversation really is, this is starting to happen. We need to start thinking about this. We need to start budgeting for this, right? And so, again, the conversations I have often are looking out 12 to 18 months, 3 years from now. How do we want the environment to look? Here are the best practices that if are not already in place, we should be talking about them. And legacy VPN replacement is kind of one of those things. The technologies in that space are technologies like zero trust or SASE, secure edge technologies, right? That at a very high level kind of put an umbrella around the whole environment, or a bubble, maybe, if you will, so that end users who are remote, who do need to access technology that still lives on a, on-premise server. File share data is a great example. It takes out of play that requirement to initiate a little piece of software, multi-factor authentication. It really makes the laptop, the remote device, know and believe that it's internal to the network all the time. So it eliminates that point of entry. It eliminates a potential entry point for bad actors. And in general, just makes it easier. Not only does it make it easier on users, it's a more secure experience. So there are a handful of products out there. TwinGate is one that CIT has started to implement in places where we're having those conversations. So those are the kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, kind of red flag. Hey, let's really make sure we're following best practice here. These things are on our radar. Zero trust is a hot topic of the day. And it doesn't point necessarily to specific technology. It points at kind of an idea, right? And I think the thing that people need to understand is, again, if I look back, 10 years ago, 10 years ago, when new technology, new devices, a new user came into the network, into the environment in order to perform their job function, or in order to get some access to some set of data, the mentality, not only of the business, but also of technology, was trust everything.
Yeah.
Right. And then what we're going to do is try to work backwards from there and determine that, oh no, actually you really only need access to this, or you really only need access to that. And not just the user, but the application. Right. And today the mentality really needs to be, don't trust anything, right? A position of deny first and allow later, or, allow once we've determined what that access means. And what that's doing in the market is it is creating some, because it's such a different mentality. If you bring an application, you bring a user, you bring a device in the network, you plug it in, you turn it on, it's got access to everything. That means it's going to be relatively easy and quick for an end user to ramp up and be able to be productive in the environment. Today, when the position is different, deny first, that means we're going to need to wade through a little bit of, I can't get access to this thing. And now I can't get access to that thing, and I need access to this. And so there's a little bit of that happens. And so I think people, businesses, organizations, users need to be a little bit patient with how that technology rolls out, just across the market, because of the cybersecurity concerns that exist today that are very real, right? If Target can get breached, so can CIT, so can the average small business, right? So the zero trust position, the deny first, is a mentality that we really all have to adopt in order to protect our business. So when we get into conversations with people about why these technologies we are recommending, it really comes from that position of, we really need to start to adopt a deny first, mentality, right?
Sure.
Those are kind of some of the things that are kind of happening right now. The conversations I'm having every day are around, things like that. Let's make sure those baseline cybersecurity tools are in place, are working for your organization. We have predictive analysis tool sets. We're covering all those entry points if they still exist. And then at the same time, we're also having conversations about, if you still do have on-premise technology, does it need to stay there? Why is this thing still here? Why do we still need legacy VPN? Can we migrate that data set? We migrate that application either to the cloud server, or is there a cloud native solution from the vendor, right? From the application vendor. So then we can eliminate remote access altogether, right? You don't have servers in the closet. You're very most important, valuable digital assets aren't living in the closet over there, right?
Yeah.
They're benefiting from Azure or AWS or, some cloud native thing where the responsibility matrix and
Yeah.
all of that exists with the vendor. It's the vendor's responsibility to maintain the technology and make sure it's recoverable and make sure the environment is safe from, any kind of threat, right?
Yeah. So, Kyle, thinking long term, cybersecurity, it changes so fast. And when we talk AI, it's changing even faster now. So, how are you creating initiatives that can last? If you're talking 5 years down the road, how do you set yourself up now for what we don't know will be coming down the road?
I kind of view they're all building blocks on the
Mhm.
technology. It's kind of the enabler. I like the idea of having the technological goal of what you
Mhm.
envision you want it to be whether we have the initiatives of becoming, a zero trust, default deny, as far as our end game on how we approach cybersecurity and risk mitigation to, whether you're going to more of a cloud-based
Mhm.
initiatives where it means that you want to remove on-premise related system sides of those because every decision
Yeah.
kind of builds on those and it typically doesn't happen in 30, 90 day sides of it. It's year over year initiative sides of it that kind of allows you to get to the end game you're at and always then reassessing at the end of the year side of it. Maybe you adjust the 5-year target slightly or the 3-year target may change as far as where you're going based upon what else the world now changed or brought to the
Mhm.
table. You can create some forks or pivots to the goal that you're going towards. But the fact that technology is always changing and initiatives may need to vary slightly, typically they're not going to make an entire U-turn or sharp, right hand turn. It's going to be more of a slight target change. Like I said, it may create a
Sure.
little more of a fork in the road, but not entirely shift your overall objective.
Definitely. So, Scott, you kind of mentioned that transition from reactive to proactive, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. How do you get a business to start making that transition if they're not already there from that, again, reactive mindset to proactive?
Sure. You know, in some circumstances, it's unfortunate, but if an organization does have an incident, that generally
Yeah.
creates a spark in people to say, okay, we had an incident. We need to be more proactive about this cybersecurity steps, that we take. Regulatory compliance, cybersecurity
Sure.
insurance, these are all things that can be very impactful on a business, and can drive those decisions and drive a proactive requirement to start adopting a modern tool set, so to speak. And so we come at it again from the NIST framework,
Mhm.
industry standard best practices, so that, we are guiding our customers, through that lens, right? Versus technology for technology's sake, or versus some kind of fear mongering conversation that says, oh boy, this risk can happen. Now that risk is very real.
Mhm.
Do need to navigate those conversations also, through examples that we've seen in the market, through unfortunate scenarios that we know have occurred with businesses that we know about, but also through the lens again of best practice. I'll go back to what I said earlier in the conversation. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, hey, you got to have some updated antivirus and you need a firewall. That was the majority of those conversations we had. Today, that's very dramatically different. Again, the requirement to have tools that can self-learn, tools that can be predictive in nature versus reactive, right? So we're looking at technology that isn't in reactive mode, right?
Mhm.
Technology that isn't trying to tell you something happened. We really need to have the technology see that something is in progress and take a proactive action, right? And so
Yeah.
self-learning AI tools that we use on a regular, that's part of that conversation, saying, here's really what we are thinking about, right?
Mhm.
And we want you to be in this conversation with us and understand why we're coming to you with these things. Not only is there regulatory concern, not only is there cybersecurity insurance impact on your business, but there's real risk, there's real loss, potential. And so that's kind of the nature by which we drive that conversation. And then we get into some specific technology examples. It depends a little bit about who we're talking about, right? When we're
Yeah.
talking business, when we're talking to decision makers, when we're talking to CFOs, CEOs, presidents, the conversation is very business focused, and it revolves a lot around risk mitigation, and kind of how that is evolving. If we're having a technical conversation, then we're down deep in the weeds, about how these things work very specifically. So, that's a lot of how those conversations navigate, and kind of how we take a customer kind of down that path. So far, those conversations have been, I feel like have been well received, right? I think if people are getting enough of this coming at them from all positions, I said even earlier, you got cybersecurity companies advertising football games now,
Yeah.
right? We're hearing it from a lot of different places. Naturally, we want to find ourselves in a position of trust where, our customers, our prospects, organizations we work with trust us, and they hear these things, and they work with us to mature how they are absorbing and taking on the initiatives that we talk about.
For sure. I started off saying we're talking strategic initiatives today. Scott brought up cybersecurity. So other than cybersecurity, Kyle, what kind of comes to mind for you when you are talking to business leaders about initiatives they should be starting now, that they should be jumping on the bandwagon if they're not already?
Well, the other main talking points is around, again, the cloud, the shift to more cloud related services sides of it, the removal of Active Directory and moving to Entra ID or a cloud identity based side of it, Okta or other types of those, or other options in that space side of it to move the identity away from that on-premise, because that is now 25 plus years old. So that has is reached its point, I think, of age, and now the other benefits that come with those sides of it, because that creates moving to an operational model versus a capital model on those components to allow the technology to expand and contract with the business needs on it, to remove the physical point of a business side of that. So by that, I mean, the business doesn't have a central data center in one of their locations that becomes the protector of all things of their data. It becomes more agnostic to the cloud, and the locations are a lot more agnostic to each other, even to that side of it, and how that can ultimately reduce risk for the organizations, because it mitigates downtime or the efforts of one location. The other area is obviously the AI conversation, which sounds like you had some conversation already. That component side of it, obviously, of what it means to the business, how it comes in, is very fluid right now. It's very dynamic, but I think having the high level business planning around it to say, look at the analysis, understand the cost ROI that could potentially come into the AI, because it's typically not coming without an expense for the AI licenses, but what is the ROI return on productivity gains, on whether it's realignment of full-time employees, the ability to expand without hiring side of it, what is the overall analysis? Because whether it's in your line of business application or in your productivity apps and other components, there is a cost to the AI, and it should be a magnitude of return, but you obviously need to do the analysis of the return and start having a review and understanding. It shouldn't be in a moment, decision purchase. And I'm likely what's going to be for a lot of organizations that they're just going to say, oh, sure, do the AI, and it costs us thousands more dollars we weren't spending last month. I don't think that's going to happen. I think you want to have a planned analysis and understanding of what is the longer term goal here with AI as we go through, because it is, I think, very well understood that you're going to want to leverage AI to be competitive in the markets going forward, almost regardless of what market you're in. But having a plan and understanding and assessing that, I think it's going to be paramount.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Scott, go ahead.
I obviously, I would echo all of that. The couple other things that I find myself talking about outside of cybersecurity, outside a little bit of AI, people do get concerned about that. They can get concerned about how the role will change. And I heard an interesting story about it on NPR the other day, and they made a reference to truck drivers and how that job is changing with self-driving. And this is certainly connected to AI, right? So really what that means, the example that they said was, what that means for the truck driver is there's a little bit less truck driving and more maintenance of the tech and the truck. So the job doesn't go away, it just evolves. Right. It was the example, kind of that they made. But the other initiatives that I'm talking about revolve around a lot around things like that, like the business process impact. Like when we migrate to the cloud or we adopt AI, our business process changes, and knowing what, where the dependencies exist going into those changes are important. And the easy one for me to make an example of, and this is also connected to migration to the cloud, is the file share data that we've all been using for 20 plus years, right? When that data moves to SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, or some other cloud platform, and we migrate away from the legacy file share server that's in the closet, there's business process dependency that really has to be thought about in advance of that move, because somebody comes into the office or fires up their laptop from home and performs a job function, and that job function may somehow be dependent on an old file share drive letter, the F drive where the file is. I got to go get that report, or I got to put that report here, or an application will interface with that file share drive letter and extract some data. Those things all change. Knowing about how that works on the front end will ease that process kind of, as you move towards that migration. So those are other kind of initiatives and things that I'm kind of hearing about and talking about. We're still talking about BCDR, business continuity and recovery. The cloud impacts that, right? Our data is going to move. We're going to move our data and applications away from our on-premise file share. And so now we're not dependent on this, file server that we need to replace every 3 to 5 years. And we don't need to back up data from it anymore. A lot of what, people's ability to perform a job function, the dependency becomes the internet. So do we have good, stable, redundant internet connectivity? Do we have a plan if the internet goes down? Some people say, oh yeah, send people home or, to some other place, or they need to be here and we need 2 internet connections and 2 firewalls and those kinds of things, right? So those are some of those initiative kind of conversations that are impacted around that change. And again, making sure that those things are thought about kind of well in advance, planning, right? Hopefully what these are, I like to tell people that this is the last certification you're ever going to have to do, right? And it kind of sparks a little bit of a cracks a smile from people who've been through that over the course of the last, 20 or 30 years. We've been together with some of our customers, and we've been through many, many, many server migrations and exchange migrations and all these things. This is the last one we ever have to do. So those are some of those the other kind of initiatives, other things I'm kind of hearing about, talking about out on the street.
The last other ones that come to mind side are, I think, dashboarding, the Power BI, again, the metric sides of those driving that data is another way you can get a lot of efficiencies and get some more insight into their actual data side of it. So maturity, their side with it. And then, we as a whole in the technology seeing the transition of the physical security getting into AI and being data centric as a data point, not just, we have the camera, we have the information, or we have the access, that they actually make it a data point, and the data you can query it against, facial access, general proximity of people in an area side of those to give you heat zones and all the other components that again, the merging of those technologies together that have been in separate island sides of that, I think is enabling for a lot of businesses, because the physical security is becoming increasingly important, not only from protections of assets, but also from liabilities that present themselves as well.
Yeah. I mean, with all of these things we've listed today, I understand this is a silly question, but I mean, where do you start? Especially Scott and Kyle, when you're walking into a room to talk to a business, are they asking you to be there for a specific reason? Or do you come in with, you need to start 1, 2, 3? What does that conversation look like?
Go ahead and start, Kyle.
Oh yeah. I was just going to say, to me, it's always about the customer side of it. So it is 100% going to be an assessment. Where are you at now? What are the goals and objective sides of it? Because there is no one size fits all for those. It's typically it's going to be a variation on those topics that we just discussed. There'll be different aspects of it. Some organizations on-premise is going to be there for some time because there are dependencies. It's a core part of what they deliver. Side of it, there's a core need for that. So again, you can't ever have the one size, but it's finding and understanding the needs of that organization, align it to the known frameworks and the known trajectory we know that the technology is moving towards, and then creating the roadmap for that customer. So each customer in each organization has to have their own assessment and guidelines. I would just advocate that you have a goal or objectives that are established. Create your 5-year plan, have a 3-year mile marker, have your 1-year mile marker. At the end of the 1 year, assess, do you need to adjust the 3 or the 5? And just keep moving it forward. Because by knowing where you want to go in the 5-year, the rest of the other decisions that you make on what becomes the priority and objectives, you can start making the plans and making it a known variable side of those. And in whatever happens with the business or other changes sides of those, you can always readjust, but at least you have a known target.
Mhm.
I think just moving through the motions and just doing the same thing you did last year side of that is puts you, I think, at a greater risk of making ill-advised purchases or purchases you're probably not going to see the ROI on, or the ultimate end goal where you need to be.
Yeah, I would agree and echo all of that. We can certainly and have very often come to the table and started from a place of guidance, not unlike the conversation we're having here today. Here are the known best practices. Here are the things you should be doing, you should be thinking about if you don't, or if you haven't already. So we're happy to start from that position and provide that degree of guidance. But at the end of the day, what Kyle has said is just paramount for us to be able to provide relevant guidance, right, to an organization's specific goals. It's really difficult for us to craft an IT strategy if we don't understand, the objectives of the organization, long-term, short-term, long-term, right? That allows us to, craft something and align, ultimately what those goals are. An organization that's trying to get acquired has a very different set of goals than an organization that is trying to acquire, right?
Mhm.
Or simply grow and meet a growth goal, right? So all those different scenarios really will ultimately dictate, a different strategy from a technology perspective. Again, there are some baseline things, and you really got to make sure you have MFA and, these kinds of things, right, at a baseline. But once we get beyond that, we start thinking about, again, the organization's objectives. Those things tend to change and evolve. Budget's an important aspect of that, right? And I tend to come at it from a perspective of the gold standard is the IT budget ratio to annual revenue is a place to start. Doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
what you have to use. It doesn't mean it's what an organization has to use, but it's a mile marker, right? So understanding and knowing annual revenue and what the ratio, what the percentage is that you've allocated for IT budget. There's a Deloitte article that anybody can Google and you can find that, in 2018 was 3.64%. In 2018, the cybersecurity measures and concerns were very different than they are today.
Mhm.
Because of what's happened since then, that ratio is more like 5 or 6% is the IT budget per annual revenue ratio. In regulated industries, healthcare, financial, that's as high as 7, 8, 9, 10+%, right? So that's another great place to start from when you're thinking about, okay, well, we know we need to do some of these technology things. What is our IT budget? That'll help dictate some of that.
Yeah. I think the only other thing that we would take into account side is if there are identified areas of high risk and
Mm.
high criticality side of those are always priority, so an example of an organization that maybe had a cybersecurity incident, those other sides of it, again, taking remediation steps that make sure that we can have the greatest reduction in risk side of it takes some immediate priority. That's always part of the field discussion. If there are areas where we know that can greatly reduce their risk, that's always high on the to-do first. Categorizing and creating a priority and listening by criticality is important. So not all efforts are equal, of course.
Oh,
I think, when I think about it at a very high level, ultimately what we're trying to do is help our customers get technology to a point where it is allowing them to innovate in their marketplace and in their organization. I classify technology really into two places. Operational, which is a lot of the stuff that we can automate with tools that, come from a third-party MSP, right? And then the things that we use to innovate within the organization, which is generally very vertical things that we participate a little bit less in. But once those operational IT things are automated, once those baseline issues, cybersecurity issues have all been addressed, you start to mature to a point where standards have been set and the budget is, to some degree predictable. And cybersecurity is a proactive thing that the organization is thinking about very regularly. Business continuity and backup is something that the organization tests very regularly. And then now that aspect of technology is on relative autopilot, let's say, it can really become something that is not simply just seen as a cost center anymore, but something that really can allow an organization to innovate in its industry, to rise above its competition, right? That's ultimately the place we're trying to take the journey we are trying to take our customers on. But it starts at that baseline. Do we have these things addressed? Because then we can get up to here, right?
I think that's a great place to wrap up, considering your budget, your objectives, having all of that, and getting to a place of innovation. Thank you so much, Scott and Kyle, for joining us today.
Always fun. Thanks, Ariel.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this topic, please let us know. Like, subscribe, or reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.